Hi, it's Andy with our Wednesday discipleship video, and I'm jumping into kind of the middle, still the first part of it, but the middle of Daniel chapter 11. If you did not watch the video on Monday, I would encourage you to watch that before you get into this, because this is truly part two, picking up the conversation where we left off the other day. And that is how accurately Daniel chapter 11, the prophecy, the vision that he had in Daniel chapter 11, and the explanation from the angel fits so well with what our history books show as happened. Now, some people actually, Daniel wrote this in some cases years, in some cases centuries before this happened, and by the time we get to chapter 12, even millennia before it has taken place. But some people look at this and say, well, that's because he wrote this in the 2nd century. Somebody else wrote this using his name in the 2nd century BC. Some even say the 2nd century AD. But the preponderance of evidence, including linguistic work and everything else, shows that this was written much earlier than many people want to believe, which would prove that he wrote this probably in the 6th century BC. Again, it's recorded that this happened around 538 is when he says this vision had taken place. So let's pick up in verse 10. And in verse 10, we find that the war continues between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies as a part of this. Two of the broken kingdoms that had come together under Alexander the Great. Now, for years, the Egyptians and the Syrians, the Egyptians being Ptolemy, the Syrians being the Seleucids, they continued at war for decades. And eventually a treaty was signed in 197 BC. And this is all being recorded here in verse 10, etc. And interestingly, that treaty included Cleopatra being given as a bride to the king of Egypt by the king of the Seleucids, or of Syria. Antiochus rose to power. He was from Syria, one of the Seleucids, and he began to invade countries along the Mediterranean Sea. Now, what does verse 18 tell us? It says that afterwards he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them, but a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Well, what commander had come to put an end to what Antiochus was doing around the Mediterranean? Well, history tells us that Rome came and said, stop what you're doing at this time, or you are going to face us at war. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. So, Antiochus returned to Syria in need to pay Rome money, and he needed money in general. And while he was in Syria, he was killed. Verse 19. Beginning in verse 21 and then ending in verse 35, we finally have the story really centering around one key figure. And this is really where the messenger, again, likely Gabriel, was bringing this whole understanding of this vision to Daniel. And this is of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And each verse in this section gives a detailed account, much more detailed than all of the other details that we've seen so far in the first 20 verses. It's all about this one man. This man's claim to fame among the Jews especially, but again, this is why he's in the Bible as well, is his treatment of the people of Israel. Now, it wasn't called Israel at that time, it was called Palestine, but this story is, again, very detailed for a man who would only be king for 12 years, but who caused the people of Israel, God's chosen people, a lot of heartache during that time. It should be noted that there's a lot of additional writings that biblical scholars will go to from 1st and 2nd Maccabees. It's called the Maccabean period, to find out more details about the people in Palestine at the time, about this leader at the time, etc. This is the intertestamental period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and there is some references that are good historical references, or at least very reasonable historical references that are a part of the Apocrypha, that intertestamental period of some of those books in the Bible. So, Verse 29 and 30, jumping ahead just a little bit, Antiochus had to withdraw from a campaign again, or he was going to face war with Rome. And upon his return, he finds an insurgence happening in Palestine. Now, verse 31 says that because of this, he profanes the temple and he forbids sacrifices from taking place. Again, we're reading this almost as if it's happened in the past, but Daniel is seeing this. This took place approximately 165, I believe, BC, which is approximately 350, 400 years after Daniel wrote these things down. So as we read this, make sure that you're understanding that he's projecting the future because of what God has given him, even though we can read this in our history books from the past. Now, First Maccabees tells us beyond this profaning of the temple and such, there were some other things that Antiochus Epiphanes IV did. First, he banned circumcision. He banned having any possession of the scriptures. He banned sacrifices, as the verse tells us, and he also banned any kind of feast. And the penalty for any of that was death. So besides forbidding these practices, he made many false promises. Verse 32 says he shall seduce them with flattery, those who violate the covenant. So he seduced them. He used flattery to get them to stumble, it says, and indeed they did. And many faithful Jews abandoned their faith, as it mentions that they were going to, again, from Scripture's perspective, here in verse 34. Antiochus then erected a statue of Zeus, or Jupiter, depending upon Greek or Roman. And it says that he was going to do that. Also, in verse 31, he also sacrificed swine at the altar. Verse 31 says, the abomination that makes desolate. What can we say about this man? He was evil. Why was Daniel given a glimpse of this? Well, he had seen the four kingdoms, the four beasts, back in the vision from Daniel chapter 7. If you watched last Wednesday's video, I touched on that just a little bit. But there was a Greek king to come, that this Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who was absolutely an evil, evil man and did very heinous things to and against the Jewish people. Eventually, though, the people did fight back. They fought back with abandon, and they were able to remove the forces. They were able to restore the temple. And in fact, in restoring the temple, they found a little bit of oil in the temple, holy oil in the temple. And they were able to light a candle. They believed that there was enough oil to keep the light going for one day. But 8 days later, that light was still burning. They considered that a miracle of God. And by that point, they were able to create some new holy oil, to get some oil that had been purified and such, and made holy one more time. And that is how the tradition of Hanukkah began. If we jump ahead another 150, 200 years, we see Jesus mentioning Hanukkah. He calls it the Feast of Dedication in John chapter 10. He also speaks of this abomination that causes desolation in Matthew chapter 24 and in Mark chapter 13. It is this abomination of desolation that Jesus says will be performed by the Antichrist, who takes everything that Antiochus Epiphanes IV did and just takes it to another level. The Antichrist takes that to another level. But what is the point of these videos? Why am I talking about how well Daniel chapter 11 fits our history books? Well, it's not about our future, but it was about a future to Daniel. And so it does accurately represent what is our history, and that's important. Because the exactness of how this prophecy unfolds, how it was fulfilled in the past, should give us confidence now that any unfulfilled promises of God will be filled, just as he has promised. The most important of those promises is that Jesus is going to return and his saints will spend eternity with him in our eternal home. As terrifying as this vision must have been for Daniel, as terrifying as this explanation must have been, knowing that his people that are at this point in exile as he's having this, but being returned to their homeland and then being decimated, being made fun of, the temple happening to it, what will happen to it, this abomination that causes desolation. Everything that happened to Daniel then can give us confidence knowing that God knows what lies ahead for us in explicit detail, and he can bring us peace even as we wait for the future to unfold now. So let us find our confidence knowing that just as Daniel faced an uncertain future and didn't like some of the things that would happen, he saw a picture, a glimpse of something even greater. Remember Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, of the Son of Man descending on the clouds before him. Just as we don't know what may happen tomorrow or next week or next year, that same promise holds true. God fulfilled these promises exactly as it was recorded in advance. And any other promises that have yet to be fulfilled will be fulfilled just as God has promised them to us as well.